I want to talk a little bit about the recruiting of Marcus Freeman, who was hired on January 8th as the new defensive coordinator at Notre Dame. We are now looking at February 10th, so he's been hired basically just over a month. And I got to say, it's been really impressive to see what he's done on the recruiting trail and what he's done with his only press conference. But more so, I want to focus on what he's done on the recruiting trail. You know, there's just been this drumbeat about Notre Dame in recent years about how they can't go after top players and they can't get this number of guys into school, and they're not, other top players aren't interested in Notre Dame because of this reason, that reason, the other reason. And the fact is Notre Dame's recruited well, but I've contended that there's another level for Notre Dame to get to. And what Marcus Freeman has done since he's gotten to Notre Dame is basically said, we're going to recruit like an elite program because we are an elite program. And that's what he's done. And the success so far has been tangible in commitments, but also in just really driving a lot of interest in the Notre Dame program based on him coming in and working with coaches that are already on staff like Mike Elson and Mike Mickens. It started first with defensive line recruiting. Within, I think, a week of Marcus Freeman being hired, Notre Dame landed a commitment from Tyson Ford. Tyson Ford's from St. Louis, Missouri. Little background on him. He's the nation's number 64 overall player and number 5 strong side end in the entire country, according to Rivals.com. If he signs with Notre Dame, he's going to be the highest ranked defensive end in Notre Dame if he stays where he's at now, since I believe the year that they signed Aaron Lynch and Stephon Tuitt and Nishak Williams. So that's right there. Obviously, it's a big impact. Now, Mike Elson had done a great job getting Notre Dame in the mix with Tyson Ford, but the reality is he was working alone. We've talked about this on other shows. When the day that Marcus Freeman was hired, there is a report from a 247 Oklahoma site that said Tyson Ford had actually silently committed to Oklahoma. Oklahoma was considered the clear leader for him. Within a week of Marcus Freeman being hired, Tyson Ford was not only interested in Notre Dame, he had committed to Notre Dame. So that was great work right there, and Marcus Freeman was a big reason for that. When Marcus Freeman was hired, Aiden Guevara, who is now a Notre Dame commit, was considered a strong lean to Penn State. Penn State, as you know, we talked about in another video, does great work in the state of Virginia. Within less than a month, Notre Dame had Aiden Guevara in the class to go with Tyson Ford. So it's already shown off in defensive line recruiting that Marcus Freeman played a big role in both. Again, Mike Elson got Notre Dame to a certain level, but it took that grinding, personable defensive coordinator to get him over the hump, which just goes to show that Notre Dame can get in the mix and quickly land top players if there's top people in the program involved in recruiting. What he's done at linebacker in the secondary is also very impressive. And I'm really curious to see what Notre Dame can do from a secondary recruiting standpoint with Mike Mickens, who had a great first year at Notre Dame without Marcus Freeman being on board. And then what Chris O'Leary can do as a young, energetic young coach that's also going to have Marcus Freeman kind of pushing and helping there. And then, of course, the linebacker recruiting where Marcus Freeman is going to drive a lot of that. But if you just look at some of the work he's done and from a recruiting standpoint since he was hired. So since Marcus Freeman was hired, these are the players that Notre Dame has offered at linebacker. Now, these rankings are the 247 sports rankings, the composite rankings. You can see Sean Murphy, Harold Perkins are 5-star players. Junior Tuialamaka from California is the number 63 player in the country. He's a consensus top 100 recruit. Within days of Notre Dame offering him, these are all offers, by the way, that have come since Marcus Freeman was hired. If you look at it, that's an offer that within days of him being offered, he was already decommitting from USC, and Notre Dame is considered to be a very strong contender for his services. So Notre Dame with Marcus Freeman has already made a big impact on that. Jalen Sneed is another top 100 recruit that has said a lot of good things about Marcus Freeman. And, of course, there's already Sebastian Cheeks, who is on the board, but he had an offer from before. He has raved about Marcus Freeman. He's another borderline top 100 recruit. And, of course, Notre Dame already has a commitment from Nolan Ziegler, who committed before. So there's the makings of already a very strong linebacking core. He now, at this point in time, just has to finish. And we've seen the same thing in the secondary. Here's the secondary offers that have gone out since Marcus Freeman was hired. Obviously, that's 4 top 100 players. Jair Brown is an interesting one. He's ranked number 123 in the country. He's an Ohio kid. He's committed to Ohio State. And according to Tom Loy at 247 Sports, and I've seen a couple other people mention this, I believe Andrew Ivins from 247 Sports also mentioned this, that He is legitimately looking at Notre Dame right now. An Ohio kid, highly ranked, Ohio State commit, is seriously considering Notre Dame because of the work of Mike Mickens and now Marcus Freeman. So when you look at that success in such a short period of time, there's a lot of momentum going on the recruiting trail right now on the defensive side of the ball. I did a video and an article at Irish Breakdown earlier showing that over the last 2 years, Notre Dame has recruited offensively as good as any team in the country. And really the only Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio, actually really only Alabama and Ohio State can really argue that they've recruited better skill players the last 2 years. But Notre Dame is right there with everybody when it comes to landing offensive talent. We've seen Notre Dame do a really good job of identifying sort of those lower ranked, high upside players. But what they haven't been able to do is land those really high level prospects in the last couple seasons. And so Marcus Freeman comes on board. He immediately hits the trail. And he's not just relying on the let's, be a developmental program. Developmental program is great, but when you can develop players with elite talent, that's even better. And we've seen him go after some of those players. So I really like the work that we're seeing from him on the recruiting trail. Now, the next step, obviously, is he's got to close. It's one thing to get yourself involved and have players like you. It's another thing to have players make the decision to come play for you. And so that's going to be that next step for what Marcus Freeman has done. But what he has done, however, and this is important, is he set a standard for the entire defensive staff, which is we're going after the best. Sometimes the best can be a guy that's going to be considered a 3-star prospect from the recruiting services, but it's a guy with a very high ceiling. That's Aiden Guevara. Sometimes the best is going to be a guy that the recruiting services also recognize as the best, and we've seen plenty of that. And I think that's the exciting thing is when your defensive coordinator is putting in that kind of work, when your defensive coordinator, who Mike Elston talked about being a tiger on the recruiting trail, when the leader of your side of the ball is the hardest worker and he's putting in the work and he's going after the best of the best, what that does is that tells everyone else on the staff that's the level we have to get to. That's so important. And that's why you need the people at the top of your program to be the most demanding and set that standard for how we're going to go about it on the recruiting trail. So very excited with what Marcus Freeman has done. And I think it's just beginning. I think there's a lot more we're going to see. The next step is going to be closing. I think over the next month or two, we're going to see several of these top players are going to end up making decisions. And I like where Notre Dame stands with a couple of them, especially junior Tuialamaka. I really like where Notre Dame stands with him right now. So I'm curious to see what that next step is going to be. But it's been a great start so far for Marcus Freeman, and he's recruiting like he's a coach in an elite program. No excuses for academics and we can't get this kid and that kid. Marcus Freeman said on his signing day press conference, the great thing about being Notre Dame is he can get anybody on the phone. So clearly there's interest in Notre Dame. Now the next step is closing, and I think he's going to do that at a very, very high level, and I'm excited to see what he's going to do on a recruiting trail. And, of course, we'll have it all covered at irishbreakdown.com. You can check out our website at irishbreakdown.com. Right now, all of our content is free. We are really trying to get as many people to be a part of our site and our community as possible. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and also hit the notifications button so that way when we do have a new video out, and so far we're putting at least 2 or 3 out a day, you'll get notified and you'll see it right away. And, of course, if you listen to podcasts, make sure you subscribe to our podcast at wherever you listen to podcasts at. We are just about everywhere now. Make sure you check out our podcast. We had a podcast today about Irish crossover podcast where Vince D'Addario interviewed Darren Pritchett talking about Notre Dame hockey. And so if hockey is your thing, check that out. But we'll have a lot coming up here about recruiting, about the team. So make sure you stay locked in, and we'll talk to you again soon.